it's Mo. It is the middle of September and I have started reading my September TBR Spin pick, and that is The Road from Corain by Jill Kerr Conway. This book is a nonfiction memoir of Jill Conway's growing up, her education, her life in the Australian bush, and her time on a farm there, as well as her moving to Sydney later in life and the rest of her life, I presume, but I'm not that far in yet. So if you don't know about TBR Spin, it is a super fun TBR busting game that you can play at any time. It was created by Jill at The Book Bully and Sarah from Freshly Read Books, and it's a riff on the TBR Tackle, which was created by Kieran at Katie Books, and the BookTube Spin, which was created by Rick McDonnell. Rick McDonnell recently back on BookTube and said that the BookTube Spin will be returning, so that is super exciting. Maybe next year we will have a TBR spin and a BookTube spin to play, which would be very fun. The premise of the BookTube spin is super simple. At the beginning of the year, we picked 12 books off of our TBR, and each month Jill or Sarah spin a wheel that have different prompts on it. Those prompts lead us to pick a book off of our TBR pile. Sometimes the prompts are guest prompts, sometimes the prompts lead us directly to a book, like a book written in a certain year or within a certain amount of years. Sometimes we have to swap out a book, but the prompts never appear twice, so each month we get a different prompt. In January we had 12 books, in February we had 11 books, in March we had 10 books, and etc, etc. So you can start playing now. You can go back and watch the September prompt, pick 4 books, and choose a book from those 4 books. You can watch the end of this video where I will be watching the October prompt, and you can use 3 books to pick from for that prompt. You could choose 12 books and go back to the very beginning and start at the January videos. Whatever you would like to do, I think would be super fun. I actually think it would be really fun as a vlog concept to do this all in one month. So if you read more than 12 books a month, to go ahead and use these prompts to pick your TBR for that month, because it would be in such quick succession, and I think that would be really cool. Like I said earlier, I will be choosing the October prompt at the end of this video. I vlog all my prompt videos. If you want to see any of those videos, there's a playlist linked down below. September, I chose The Road from Corain, specifically because it's also Straya September, which is a readathon put on by Scott at Gunpowder Fiction and Plot, all about reading Australian works. It's also Shorty September, which is put on by Past Storytime, and that is a readathon to read short books. My definition of a short book is under 250 pages, and The Road to Corain comes in at 238. This book was also recommended to me by my mom. This is actually her copy. She read it a few years ago and gave it to me to read. I had not had the chance to read it yet, and now I am. I am really enjoying this book so far. The first chapter kind of gives you just a little bit of history of the Australian bush and how farmers were allotted land then, and how specifically soldiers were allotted land, free land, to farm on after World War I. Jill Kerr Conway's father was a World War I veteran, but had to wait until he married to get his parcel of land. And when he fell in love and had a whirlwind romance with Jill's mom, they were able to get a large piece of land and even acquire a little bit more to have a sheep farming ranch. They raised sheep for wool primarily, but they also used the animals for meat. They had chickens, etc, etc. And the very beginning of this book kind of gives you that little brief overview of how the land was divided in Australia and why. And then we start right in with Conway's parents' story, how her brothers were born, how she was born, and their life going forward at the farm that they named Corain. It's an extremely difficult life. They face many trials and tribulations, and I'm about halfway through now. I've just reached the part where Conway and her mother are leaving Corain, possibly forever, because of all the hardships, because of extreme drought that's happening in the Australian bush at the time, and Conway is entering like more traditional school for the first times and thinking about education. Throughout this book, Conway talks about her life, how she was raised, what she had to deal with as a very young child, how she had to take care of her parents' emotional states when her brothers went to boarding school and the droughts got worse, and everything that happened up until her life at about 12 or 13 when she moved to Sydney. I'm sure the end of this book is going to continue with her life as a young student and then later as an older student, an older person, her life, her marriage. I'm not sure how far we get into this. I'm sure there are dates mentioned, but I know that this takes place like in the 20s and 30s and then through the Second World War as well, and so on throughout Conway's life. This book was published in 1990. Conway talks a lot about how isolated their life was, living on a super remote farm with, you know, nearest neighbors hundreds of miles away, with nearest cities thousands of miles away, how that affected her as a child, how that came across in her upbringing, and also how her parents, although they were only educated so much, put forth that all their children had to be extremely educated and like well raised, and how much colonialism dictated what like well raised meant, how they talked, what they wore, what they had in their house, and how they conducted their everyday life and their business. So it's interesting that there is such a thread of the colonialism that Conway didn't even understand at the time. And right where I am in the book now, she's learning a little bit more about that, going to various schools in Sydney and trying to find her place and being thrust from a life of isolation and rural upbringing to a more suburban life. And she's seeing a lot more of the culture of Australia through that. But where I am in the book, as a young teenager, she doesn't really know all those things yet. She sees them, but she doesn't understand them. So Conway is reflecting back on how this was her first initial foray into a wider Australian world and Australian culture, and how, as a older person looking back, she wishes some things had been different so that she could have even more understood Australian poetry and Australian artists and taken advantage of seeing some of those things as they happened. Whereas the schools that she went to and her mother's kind of built-in social prejudices kept them in a much more colonized culture, and keeping with the idea that like England is so great and Australia kind of gets left by the wayside. So there's a lot of interesting like history in this. There's a lot of transferable ideas. The idea of like rural living and farming can be transferred from Australia to many other places, but the landscape of Australia is just so extreme and so harsh that lends kind of an extra immediacy and need to the stories of these people. And then there's a little bit of touching upon like Indigenous people and Aboriginal people and how they were treated and where they fit in this kind of social hierarchy. There's the whole idea of the wars and people being conscripted to the war, people being drafted, the severe PTSD that Conway's father had from the First World War, and then seeing the potentiality of his sons being drafted, things like that. So things, again, that you might see in other cultures, but told very specifically from an Australian lens and from a colonized Australian lens. I'm really enjoying it so far. It's beautifully written. The first chapter that was all about the landscape of Australia and the history of the bush was really interesting and pretty. I thought it might be a little too flowery, but it didn't stay that flowery, which was nice. Now that we're getting to see Conway in an older state, she is reflecting back more as she's writing about the times, which is adding like another dimension to the writing as well as the storytelling. I will say that I'm struggling with this the way that I was struggling with Foster, which I read earlier this month, in that I'm expecting something bad to happen. I'm always waiting for, not only for there to be the normal bad things that happen in life, bullies, injury, sickness, but that something like truly horrible is going to happen. And some truly horrible things happen, but they're told in a very matter-of-fact way. They're told in a way that this was part of life and that death is part of life. Conway was raised with the mentality to be stoic, with the idea that girls shouldn't cry, that people shouldn't cry over lost loved ones or over lost animals or over disasters that have happened, that they should persevere, continue to pursue the life that they need to do, and continue to be stoic and solid even at times of extreme duress. So horrible things are happening in this book, but I'm more talking about, like, I'm expecting her not only to get bullied, but to, like, get abused and beat up. I'm expecting her life at boarding school to be, like, nefariously abusive and detrimental to her upbringing, which I hope doesn't happen. And again, this is more about me than it is about the book, but I'm so conditioned now when reading and when watching media and when consuming media to expect the worst, to expect rape and sexual assault and murder and extreme prejudice, to expect racism and sexism, misogyny, and lack of understanding for other people. And I just wonder if that's because of media and because of what I read, and because that is so, it's a common theme in so many people's lives, but it's also so much a common theme in the media that I consume. Or is it because of the world? Like, do I feel that way because at every turn right now in our American society, horrible things are happening and people are being horrible to each other, and there's so much extreme racism and abuse, and people are allowed to murder with impunity, and people are allowed to get away with societal ills that they should not be able to do. So is it maybe a thought spiral fear of the current day, and that I'm always expecting something awful, that you can't expect for the world to get better, that you can only expect for the world to get worse? Or is it just that I read too much horror? I don't know. When I read some more of The Road from Crane, I will let you know. It is October 1st, and I don't think I ever wrapped up The Road from Crane by Jill Kerr Conway. I finished this a long time ago now, like 3 weeks ago, and I really enjoyed it. It followed Conway's life from infancy, before her birth, her parents getting together, and the birth of her brothers, to her birth, to her young childhood living on a farm, a sheep farm in the plains of Australia, then when her mother and she had to move into the city in Sydney, and then her life growing up and kind of how she became aware of class divides and the history of Australia, and how she became passionate about learning about the history of Australia and colonization, and also how that affected Australia and how that compares to other colonized places that became independent, such as the United States. This book ends when Conway decides to move out of Australia to the United States to continue her schooling, because she is not getting what she needs in Australia, even though she wants to learn about Australia. Obviously, this book was written later in life, so there are certain moments when Conway kind of interjects the linear story to say that, like, she wishes this maybe had been different, or if she had known then what she knows now, she would have done things in a different manner or taken a different path. But those are kind of far and few between, and mostly it is just her life story from birth to young adulthood in her early to mid-20s. It focuses a lot on her education as a person and how her, not just her schooling, but her education of life through watching her parents, through her brothers' lives and their interests and ideas, through people that she met and was influenced by once she moved to Sydney, and also the paths that she didn't take, the schooling that she didn't do, and the class divide that she kept herself on one side of, and she was also kept by her mother and things like that. It has a lot to do with grief and tragedy and how those things are inextricably linked to your education as a person and to who you become as a young person growing up. It reminded me a lot of Out of Africa in the nature descriptions and in the love and longing that Conway has for the Australian bush and for the Australian plains and growing up farming, and how farming is such an education and teaches you so many things about life, whether you're coming to that as a child like Conway was, or whether you're coming to that as an adult the way Isak Dinesen was. The two stories were happening basically around the same time in very vastly different places, obviously, and Isak Dinesen was an adult where Conway was a child. Isak Dinesen has a much more poetic way of writing and a much more lyrical and graphic, as in picturesque, way of saying things, but Conway definitely depicts nature and city life in a beautiful way as well. She just has more of a scholarly, observational view of it, whereas I think Isak Dinesen talks in a much more like poetic manner about it. Conway has written other books, so it would be interesting to see if one follows the rest of her life the way this one followed her early life. I would love to know kind of the conclusion of her story in her own words. I think that would be really interesting. I'm super glad to have read this for the TBR Spin. I'm super glad to have read it for Stray September. It was the only book that I got to for Stray September, unfortunately, but I think it's a good one because it does touch so much on Australian history. It doesn't explain Australian history, it does touch on Australian history through the lens of an influential person. I don't know if Conway was influential to Australia, but I think she in her own right was an influence on education and the idea of how to educate people on Australian history. It is October 1st. I saw that Freshly Read Books put up the new Spin video. I say this every time, but I still have Florida to read. I put that on my end of year TBR. It was also on my summer TBR. It's also one of my TBR Spin books. So I will be reading Florida at one point, but this video probably is going to come out as an extra TBR Spin video towards the end of the year. On my TBR Spin list, I still have Ruby Fruit Jungle by Rita Mae Brown, The Bean Trees by Barbara Kingsolver, and The Adventures of Amina Al-Sarafi by Shannon Chakraborty. So I'm still very interested in all of these. Let's see what the Spin says. Sarah just said an interesting thing about how, because our TBR pile is so small, it's more and more likely that we'll have to swap out books to accurately fit the prompts. Okay, so the wheel spun and it was a book set in a small community, farm, village, small town, etc. I don't think any of these fit perfectly. This is about a southern girl growing up, realizing she's queer, moving to New York, living a life. This is about a Kentucky girl growing up, wanting to get out of her small town, moving to Tucson, I think, Tucson, Arizona, and figuring out her life, living life. And this is about an older pirate reflecting on her life. So I think out of the three of these, probably The Bean Trees is the closest. After reading the back, I'm not as super excited to read this one, but I have been wanting to read a Barbara Kingsolver, and this one is on the shorter side at only 132 pages. But let's see what the end of the video is, just in case there's any tricks up Sarah's sleeve. No surprises there. When was this written? This was written in 1988, so I think this is probably one of her earlier works. It's very small font, but like very large margins and short chapters, so I think this will be a quick read. Like all my TBR Spin books, I will be vlogging it, so you will see a book for this one coming out in early November so that I can also pick my November book. Please let me know if you're participating this month. Let me know what book you pick. Let me know if you've read The Bean Trees and what you thought of it. And thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!